Aloha and welcome to Island Connections. I'm Ibrahim Aoudé, the Palestinian 2021 Uprising and BDS. Obviously, BDS stands for Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions against the Zionist entity in occupied Palestine. For this topic, we have with us Professor Cynthia Franklin from English, and Ph.D. candidate of political science, Ali Musleh. And thank you for coming to talk about this particular topic. So one of the questions I was thinking about was like, since you have worked in support of justice for the Palestinian people suffering under Zionist settler colonialism, how did the 2021 May uprising impact you and your work in support of the Palestinians? And we can start with Cindy, since she's been very active, also Ali, but active and spearheading a bunch of activities and issues around that matter. So Cindy, go ahead.
Well, I think that uprising was both really, on the one hand, in response to devastating violence, that, kind of destruction of neighborhoods, bombings again in Gaza, these things that are horrific, demoralizing, and depressing. At the same time, the kind of unified response across Palestine, and by Palestine, I'm including what happens inside the 48 borders, or inside 48, inside the 67 borders, in the West Bank, in Gaza, just that unity, and then unity actually beyond Palestine and into the diaspora, and then with the international community. I feel like there was such a coming together and a really kind of one voice saying, this has got to stop, and we are going to stand for a free Palestine. So it was, on the one hand, very demoralizing and hopeless, and on the other hand, really exciting to see this massive uprising. And one index of that, I think, is in Hawaii, where, because there's not a lot of Palestinians, and there's also not a strong Zionist presence, Palestine is often not a kind of hot topic here, but Ihi Lasconia sent me a text, and she's like, what are we doing to save Sheikh Jarrah? And so I sent out an email to about, I don't know, to a list I have. It's a large list, and Ihi designed a graphic, and we just pushed it out on Facebook and Instagram, and we had a really significant showing that was pretty, unprecedented for Hawaii in terms of a stand for Palestine. And then followed that up, Ali and Man and I organized a solidarity gathering for the fall. I think was it the following week, Ali? Was it just the next week? I think it was just the next week. Over 60 people came to talk about what can we do, how can we mobilize. And I think I'm going into this at some length just because that had not happened before, just to get that kind of level of engagement and that kind of showing up for Palestine. And I think that we could see that happening in different parts of the world, as well as within Palestine.
We're gonna be talking more about that. I'm gonna ask you about international support here in US, Hawaii as well. But I saw that graphic that he did, and I saw the gathering, call for a gathering as well. Anyway, so Ali, you are political scientist. You're Palestinian, and you are in Hawaii. So similarly, in terms of how did the whole May 2021 uprising impact you and your work? And we can also, you can comment on your work in Hawaii, but we will be delegating some time for that in a bit. So please go ahead.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, first, thank you for inviting me to talk with you all. It's great to see you, both of you. Like many Palestinians, I'm still processing. We learned a lot, and I'm starting to kind of recognize what happened in May as a kind of collective Palestinian study in how to defend ourselves first, how to defend people in Sheikh Jarrah, but also in doing that, we disrupted that whole apparatus they call the Israeli state. The Israelis thought that they can fragment us, put us in these little reservations, give us different names, and assume that we will be the products of their violence. That's all we can be. That we will take this violence as our truth and forget that we are Palestinians. That it matters what happens in Sheikh Jarrah. That it matters for Gazans what happens in Sheikh Jarrah. That it matters for people in the valley, the Dead Sea, what happens to people in Sheikh Jarrah. Or what it matters to me, a Palestinian in Hawaii, what happens in Beta, right, in Nablus. And they were wrong. They were very, very wrong. They were wrong, so wrong. They were stupid. It's remarkable, and they were shocked. It was really remarkable just to see, the images coming out of Akka. I'm from Akka.
Mm-hmm.
You'd think the Israelis are just trying to kind of, occupy an area in the West Bank, but it was Akka.
Mm-hmm.
Same images from Jaffa and Haifa.
Mm-hmm.
They really, really made that whole state look like a colonial imposition and nothing more.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. This has been a very significant moment. I think it's ongoing. I don't think it's stopped. I think what we saw was a moment of intensification of all those practices that occur every day wherever we confront that state, that war apparatus. They intensified. There were resonances. There were connections. There was creativity. There was a deep critique of what occurred in the last 25 years. It was so deep that so many people who are part of that apparatus from Oslo onward found absolutely...
Can I interrupt? And if you would explain more, 25 years, the past 25 years. You mentioned Oslo, but, if you could elaborate on that.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, the whole idea that, this land can be separated into a state and semi-autonomous entities that are disconnected from each other, that masquerades as a state, but is in reality a bunch of reservations, and we can call that peace. That has been the program of Oslo. some Palestinians subscribed to that program, became part of that program, became tools and instruments of that program. They became tools and instruments of that program to such an extent that they even forgot what is at stake. And when the uprising occurred in May, they weren't even able to recognize or find a place for themselves in the struggle. They were absent.
Yeah, yeah.
And I'm talking here about the Oslo Authority, or the Palestinian Authority.
Yeah.
They were, and their absence was not simply a product of them abandoning us, or it was basically just that we surpassed them.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. They were surprised too. Yeah, we can talk more about that, but let me just say something here. I'm Palestinian. Yeah, grew up in Lebanon and all of that. So I'm Palestinian. I'm Lebanese. I'm Arab, like you are. You're Arab. You're Palestinian. So Jordan too, right? Yeah. So the thing with that is that the majority of the Palestinians at this point are against Oslo Accords of 1993, because what it did, it really disintegrated the Palestinian population even more than like just inside 1948 occupied Palestine and West Bank and Gaza. It even disintegrated more in terms of these leopard spots in the West Bank, for instance, that you mentioned, that they want to make a state out of it. But even that, the Israelis now, the Zionists, don't say that they want to give a state to the Palestinians. I mean, the latest announcements by Israeli, big guns, like Bennett, the prime minister, and Benny Gantz, the defense or offense minister, and all of these guys. So that's good. So before we go to another topic on that, there's an interview with Aoudé about that. So let's hear what he has to say, and then we come back on set. All right.
Personally, it's definitely been a positive impact because it's just showing that there is progression in the Palestinian struggle and the understanding of the Palestinian struggle and cause internationally. I think the most important take from the uprising of 2021 is that the popular movement has regained its respect in the international arena, I think, in terms of fighting for freedom. And I think that's a well-deserved respect, and also revived the hope that we've always had in people, and that is the only way that we can achieve in many ways our personal freedoms, is that if we interconnect with others. So it's been overwhelming, it's been positive, and I think really important in the progression of our struggle for our freedom.
All right, so we heard what Man has said, so to speak. And we go to the other issue that Cindy began talking about, and I would like of Cindy to discuss it more. And this is like how might you evaluate the outpouring of support, international support, and we can focus also, you can talk about international support as a whole, but we can focus maybe on the US and Hawaii. And you began with Hawaii, with the IHI and, other kinds of supports, like with the 60 people that met and started discussing what they might do. So Cindy, please.
Well, I think that one of the exciting things that has happened in the last few months that I think was sparked by the kind of coming together and the kind of saying, we're not going to look to any state formations for answers. We're going to do it ourselves. And we're not going to be bound by different, kind of borders in terms of how we come together to support Palestine. And one of the things that happened in Hawaii was just the formation of new leadership, new organizations. There is a spinoff of the Muslim Association of Hawaii here. Some young women who came together as Hawaii for Palestine and organized a march through Waikiki, which was fabulous. There was Rebecca Goldschmidt helped revive Jewish Voice for Peace Hawaii, which had been like, I don't know, 2 of us, and now has some legs. And just this kind of, Rebecca and Ali have done a few film nights that people have turned out for, and they want to talk. They want to learn. They want to get active. And so I feel like it's been this kind of time to mobilize, to organize, and that people are motivated to do that. And then in just the kind of larger landscape, we're seeing companies like Ben & Jerry's saying, oh, I guess there's a problem in the occupied territories. It's a start. But, I think that that's an index of how this kind of mobilization in the US is having some impact. It's mainstreaming BDS in a way that I think we haven't seen before. At the same time, I'm sort of bracing myself for what's going to happen this fall in relation to the IRA, the definition that has come up for anti-Semitism that through an emergency resolution, Donald Trump endorsed. It's a definition of anti-Semitism. It's the International Holocaust Remembrance Act. Sorry, that the shorthand for that is the IRA. Mm-hmm. Under that definition, 8 of the 10 examples specifically highlight anything that's a critique of Israel or support for Palestine as a form of anti-Semitism. That was one of the few executive orders that Joe Biden enthusiastically supported of Trump's at the time that he was rolling back a bunch of other of Trump's emergency declarations. And so we're starting to see this on college campuses, the implementation of the IRA definition. And so I think we can expect some pretty heated battles coming up around that are a response to the success of the movement, the mainstreaming of the movement. It's a form of backlash against the fact that I think that there's been these really significant victories and mainstreaming of the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, including in Hawaii.
Yeah, Joe Biden from way back, and he repeated it several times that he was a Zionist, Israel has a right to defend itself, regardless of all this talk, his talk, and US government talk about human rights and self-determination and all this is out the window everywhere in the world, but noticed especially in Palestine. The Palestinians have no right to defend themselves against Israeli occupation. So he's talking, contrary to international law and international humanitarian law. So there's the hypocrisy of the United States. And were it not for US supporting the Oslo Accords, etc., the Palestinians wouldn't have been in this kind of predicament that they have been. But as Ali has mentioned, is that we do not succumb to the occupier. We defy him, even with rocks and bare chests. So Ali, any more on this matter of the outpouring of international support and your activities in this matter?
I want to start with activities here in Hawaii and the islands. To be honest, when the Israelis began bombing Gaza, and I began to see all the images of the children being massacred. I mean, it's just crazy that, you know, they have 2 million people, they bomb them every time they bomb. And it just breaks your heart and makes you, you know, furious. You know, when the events here began, people began organizing, and we had these events. The protests, then the gatherings after, the movie nights, and you know, it was really healing. just being with other people. I felt like a lot of us Palestinians outside of Palestine really needed that. You know? Not necessarily, you know, people coming to our aid or anything like that. Just being with us. You know? Being with people who care about you, about others, about their well-being, and always understanding their well-being as something that is not provided by those states, is just changes you. It changes you. It touches you and it changes you. And this was my experience. I met new people this summer, people I haven't met in the 6 years of, you know, doing events and meeting people and doing panels and organizing, which was great. I felt like, and this was kind of mainly Man's provocation to kind of just like sit together, you know. We organized the first protest, and then he was like, you know, how about just a gathering, like eat together, talk, you know, plan, do those little study groups, and that's what we did. What came out of it was this kind of resurgence of Jewish Voice for Peace, and kind of the first project was those movie nights, just to kind of, you know, this one group was thinking, what is the role of arts and media, alternative media? What is the role of film in disrupting the images and narratives of mainstream? How can they make us think otherwise? And from that study group came out the movie nights, and this is how they began, and they were beautiful. You know, we watched the movie and just like sit for an hour and a half or two till, you know, like 10 or 11 p.m. and people are just talking. Mm-hmm. I'm like, go home, you know, you have lives, you need to sleep. And they're still talking, but you know, but that scene teaches us this and that. Mm-hmm. So, you know, that was fantastic.
Yeah, in fact, you know, I've been, after a long while of a hiatus, I've been active on Facebook, you know, so I comment and all of that. And you find a lot of people, you know, giving support and all of that. And then there's this Roger Waters, everybody knows him, yeah, from Pink Floyd. And I was watching something quick for him a couple of days ago, a song he was playing about we shall liberate the land from the river to the sea. So, I mean, that is an important statement that goes against the Palestinian National Authority that has betrayed its own people.
Yeah, from the wall to the wall.
Yeah, and and is subservient to the Israelis and collaborates with the Israelis, and you know, detains and imprisons its own people because the Israelis would ask them to do so, and so on. So they are like you know, traitors to the cause, you know, and this is a very important thing, and came out loud and clear during this uprising, which I think is ongoing, but it has its ebbs and flows. And so I wanted to say that this international support is really significant, And so we will go to other questions in terms of, around that particular issue. But to what, and we begin with Ali, since you're on screen right now. To what would you attribute this qualitative shift in international support, one, and in your opinion, the role of BDS and the academic boycott of the settler colonial state in occupied Palestine in that matter, in giving international support and so forth?
To be honest, I don't know how much of a shift there was. It's just, Palestine has always moved people. It's always moved people. It's just that we had these people who were imposed on us, from the authority that are just, can't move themselves, So I think people have always been inspired by Palestine. Palestinians have always been inspiring. They always have something to add. They always have something that calls upon people to think and act and dream and can find refuge in each other, to go out to the streets. Because I grew up with these images everywhere, but at the same time, it was also significant to see all those people who came out, and in everybody's mind is the image of that settler who in Sheikh Jarrah, who was like, if I don't see it, somebody else will.
Jacob.
Yeah.
Jacob.
Yeah, the most famous settler in the world right now, Jacob, So everybody's thinking of this Jacob, from New York, who's like, if I don't steal it, and everybody's like, there are millions of people who are like, what is this Jacob?
Like, it reminds me of someone says, well, if I didn't rape her, someone else would, what I mean?
It's nuts.
It's amazing,
yeah.
Crazy.
It was like the dumb version of discovery, right? Like, I found it, it's just, I think the Israelis were, ready to kind of, dig a hole and jump in it. That was because people were protesting and everybody was thinking of that man, what he said. And it kind of, made visible in very direct, crude and dumb way, what this project is all about.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And that's embarrassing to them. They want other stories. They want people to believe these stories that they tell, some mythical, miraculous story of how Israel, and then comes Jacob,
Yeah, good thing. Thanks to Jacob, actually. Anti-Israeli propaganda.
Right.
Like scoring a goal in your own goal. Target.
Yeah, so embarrassing. Yeah, you could watch it over and over again, like those videos where somebody shoots.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
I recommend everyone go to Facebook and watch that thing. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, just remarkable. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Everybody should watch it. So one thing that we can say about those protests is that, it was about settler colonialism. Right? This is just, wow. millions of people around the world are protesting against settler colonialism. You know, not because, you know, Palestinian lives matter or something like that, you know, the slogan that we tried to take for ourselves from the struggles of Black folk here in North America and everywhere. As it is always been the struggle for Black life, you know, that has been significant and important, not just particular individuals. Same thing with Palestinians, that it's Palestinian life against the settler colony.
Yeah. Can I stop you here?
Absolutely.
In the interest of time, but we can continue. You can continue with your thought later on, but I want to hear, if I may, from Cindy on that, and as briefly as you can, but please, you know, finish your thought as you are talking.
Okay, so I have 2 points I think I want to make. One, you know, about why this coming together. I think one has to do with Zoom and the possibilities for having webinars and forums and gatherings. On the one hand, Zoom is horrible. Like, I like seeing people in person, and there are kinds of exchanges and relationships you build that can only happen in person through sharing stories and meals together. And that was the point of the solidarity gathering that Mon was, you know, kind of saw the importance of. But on the other hand, I feel like there's been this shift and a recognition that Palestinians have been speaking throughout this whole, you know, kind of these many decades of occupation and ethnic cleansing and apartheid. But often a Jewish American will be brought in to speak on this, or an Israeli Jew will be brought in who is anti-Zionist. And I think that the excuses I think that that's becoming less acceptable to do. And I think one of the things that Zoom did make possible was to hear from Palestinians in Palestine, because in-person events were not possible. And so I think it made it more possible to bring people together from, you know, from Palestine and then different parts of the world to speak. There was such an outpouring of writing and seminars and teach-ins. It was just like this kind of brilliant explosion of truth-telling to the state that happened, along with people being in the streets. There was just incredible intellectual production. So that's one thing. And then the other thing is, I think we're in a moment in time where different movements are really working together and learning from each other and recognizing that none of us are free until all of us are free. And so I think that Mauna Kea has everything to do with what's happened in Hawaii around Palestine and around the movement for Black lives. I think these movements are all in conversation with each other, and there's a recognition that you can't be siloed off with your own thing, that you have to be working together and discovering these connections. And so I think that's happening. I just was talking to Andre Perez about the art build that he organized for Mauna Kea, and how much of that was training from Standing Rock, and how Standing Rock artists designed a lot of the Mauna Kea posters. And then we're up at Mauna Kea taking turns each month to do art trainings and art builds. And I think that kind of synergy is happening right now. And so I think that has a lot to do with what's happening as well. Just a refusal to siphon off different movements.
Right. In fact, Palestinians who went up to Mauna Kea were surprised to see the Palestinian flag up there, even before they left. Okay, and now perhaps we'll hear from Man on those issues. Quickly, let's see what he has to say, and then we move to another issue.
Also on the same note, the support that we've received from the people of all of these beautiful countries has been extremely overwhelming in a positive way again. And that, I think, it's important to note that this support is coming from the people, from those who are suffering as well on different levels. And it really emphasizes the beauty of the interconnectedness of our struggles as human beings, regardless of what it is. What is it that we are facing? So I think the Palestinian struggle isn't any different from that of history and what happened throughout history. So if anything, it proves this support that we have been receiving as Palestinians proves that justice is on our court, and we are fighting for a just cause. So yeah, definitely a really important point. And I think I actually want to add that people's support is important because and necessary because they are the international world is also complicit in through their governments and through taxes directly to the suffering of the Palestinian population. And I think it was beautiful to see that people are more aware of their complicity. Well, I think the BDS sits at the epitome of that support that you're talking about, and its impact is extremely important in our struggle because it shows that when people come together to fight, because I think our enemy is the same, it's capitalism, it's colonialism, it's sexism, it's racism. I think they're all under the same umbrella, and when BDS comes into play, it shows really how impactful it can be for people across the world to stand with another people. And by just academic boycott, divestment, and sanctioning, against all these regimes and colonial powers of any form, can have a really, really beautiful impact on them. So, and you can easily tell from the way Israel is reacting to this, they're extremely scared and afraid of that unity, and BDS really shows that when people come together, they can eliminate and put an end to the colonialism that is taking place. Of course, I think I attribute this support to such efforts, and only do I believe that we cannot achieve our freedom as Palestinians without the freedom of other marginalized communities, and I really, really mean that. And without the rights for women are met, without people of all kinds of religions can practice their religion, we cannot achieve our freedom as Palestinians. I really do believe that it's connected to all the struggles around the world, to the sovereignty movement, and the fight against the colonialism and occupation of the islands of Hawaii. All people around the world must come together to fight against. So I attribute this to these efforts, of course.
All right. So another question that I think is important, and since you are here, Cindy, on screen, we begin with you. There were like successes and all of that we talked about, and significant shift in terms of the Palestinian struggle itself, unity. And we are now one people, not like divided. Ali mentioned how we fought those kinds of divisions by action on the ground. So what are some pitfalls, or some of the pitfalls that must be avoided in order to build upon those gains that have happened thus far? So Cindy.
I don't know if this is a pitfall as much as a difficulty and a challenge. And I think, when Israel is bombing Gaza, people mobilize around that. It's an event. It's in the news. It's on people's social media. But then, that stops, at least so spectacularly. And people are tired, because the everyday low-level violence continues. And there's so much everyday low-level violence, and then there will be spectacular violence elsewhere that gets people's attention. And so I think one of the challenges is to realize that in those periods of relative quiet, where the violence is more slow and every day, that's when you need to keep the pressure up. That's when you need to keep organizing. That's when you need to do your long-term strategic planning. And I think that's hard, because I think one of the things the settler state depends upon is exhaustion and despair, and doing this kind of siege, then withdrawal, siege and withdrawal. And I think that a challenge is, how do you keep your energy up? How do you maintain a focus on the organizing that needs to happen? And I think some of that, to go back to some of the things Ali has been talking about, have to do with love and friendship and care. And that if you don't have those bonds together, going out into the street for an hour at a time is great, but that's not where revolution happens. That's not where substantive change happens. Substantive change has to happen through every day comings together and work and building relationships and figuring out a future together. So not so much a pitfall as much as a challenge.
That's good, Cindy. Like I'm thinking that the colonialist and the imperialist, like United States supporting Israel and all of that, they seem not to learn from mistakes. Even some Americans now in like criticizing Biden's activities in Afghanistan. So we never learned anything from Vietnam, although some of them say yes, but actually we look at it and they haven't learned anything from Vietnam. And because people are there, they live there, they're not gonna go anywhere. And you cannot ethnically cleanse them now as you did in 1948 without resistance, And that resistance showed and made a qualitative shift in terms of Palestinian resistance and Palestinian identity and the rest of it. So this is an important thing that the imperialist and the settler colonialist never learns, yeah? So anyway, let's hear what Ma'an has to say on this matter, and then we go from there.
I definitely think that if the organic and natural unfolding of the Palestinian movement as a popular movement is let alone and is represented by the people themselves, then there won't be any pitfalls. But I don't know if you're referring to the representation or the official quote unquote representation of the Palestinian people by the PA or any peace talks with Israel that is done so, or any kind of international intervention, then obviously there would be pitfalls, but these pitfalls do not represent the Palestinian people. And as a Palestinian refugee, I can tell you that on the street, those are not regarded and they're not respected of any sort. Yeah, so I think that's a simple way to say it, but obviously this gets a bit more complicated, but it does not represent us. Let me just say that as a Palestinian refugee from Dahisha, that the core of the Palestinian struggle, it comes from these refugee camps, and our right of return sits at the top of that struggle. So when we are not the ones representing our struggles, then there could be a lot of misinterpretations that come our way. And let it be simple that history has proven over and over again that justice will prevail and colonialism always comes to an end. 200 years in Algeria and many more in many other places in the past has only ended with a just cause. So I think Israel is no exception here, and we as Palestinians should still be focused on it, and any forms of international intervention or acclamations against us should be ignored. So that must be definitely always remembered. So I think our freedom is definitely around the corner.
All right. Okay. So Ali, how about pitfalls, challenges, what have you?
Well, one of the things we've seen is that the authority, once it found that it has no place in the current moment, just asserted itself through violence, because that's the only way for it to have any kind of meaningful presence, I guess. That's been that is very dangerous. I think it's not just the authority, but a lot of people who are part of the old apparatus that found that they have no place are also going to retaliate somehow. But still, I mean, they're not necessarily succeeding, but that's a challenge. But one thing we need to remember is, if you follow up on what's going on, people learned a lot from May. They've been organizing, in Beta, a village near Nablus. They've been, organized. That entire town has been organizing, right? Kind of reassembling, on reinventing ways of assembly to just be present on the land to deter settler expansion and acquisition of a nearby mountain, Jabal Asbah. They've been conducting what is called nightly disturbance or confusion operations. Gazans learned from that, so they've been conducting their own confusion operations throughout that the contact zones with Israeli military. They've been learning from each other. We learned a lot. And I think a lot of people have took what they learned and they are implementing them on the ground right now. That knowledge is proliferating. And that knowledge is changing us, is changing how we organize, how we assemble the new tools that we're building. So, a lot has happened. And I feel like one important thing is that we forget is that, it is an event, but events transform. Events transform. I mean, it was, I heard a lot of Palestinians comparing, uprising to an intifada, and could an uprising transform into an intifada? But, both of them were events, perhaps having different durations, but, the duration doesn't necessarily determine impact. I want us to remember that. And I want us to remember, even sometimes small things transform. I mean, I've been thinking a lot of that moment in 2014 when Palestinians began sending tips to protesters and defenders in Ferguson, about how to defend themselves and deal with tear gas. One beautiful thing that Fred Moten wrote was, that became a study in Black Palestinian breath. We began to think of Palestinian and Black experience as atmospheric. And we began to tie it to, yes, to tear gas, but also to all those transformations to the environment, to our earth, how we can live on this earth. The amount of knowledge and studies and discussions and panels that emerged after that are, just there's a wealth of them now. This is occurring today now in Hawaii and other places.
Yeah, wonderful. We have like a few minutes left, I think 4 or 5. So I have this, I've been thinking about like the conflation of anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism in light of Zionist propaganda, against Palestinians, against Muslims, and they conflate Muslims with Palestinians and Arab and the rest of it. So that conflation of anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, Cindy, you talked about before, at the beginning, actually. So what is the role of that in terms of Zionist propaganda, and how can we counter it? Cindy.
Well, it seems increasingly like it's all they got, is that conflation. And I think that insisting on different frameworks is really crucial. Insisting on a settler colonial framework, insisting on the apartheid framework. I think that, I know the apartheid framework is getting some important criticism as not being situated enough within the settler colonial framework. But so I think that foregrounding that this is about, these practices, these racist colonial practices, this is not about religion. One of the reasons that I, when I'm doing this work, often don't talk about being Jewish is because I don't want that to be the focus. This is a settler colonial struggle, and the kind of hijacking of any kind, well, it's not hijacking, but the framing of this as about Jews against Palestinians is one that the Israeli state absolutely depends upon. And so I think it's about shifting that framework and refusing that framework altogether.
Yeah, we have like a couple more minutes. Ali, on that, please, in a couple of minutes or less.
One thing we have to remember all the time, is that the Israeli state itself is an artifact of anti-Semitism. When they try to weaponize that against us, we have to remember the history of that state being completely and radically connected to an anti-Semitism in Europe that saw that Jews have no place there and therefore have to be sent and concentrated elsewhere. So anti-Semitism has always been connected to right-wing agenda, a global right-wing agenda, and we have to keep sight of that. Never forget that.
It has its origins actually in Christianity and how Christians thought about Jews, one, and also the colonial situation, like colonial Britain, for instance, or the colonial French and all of that. Europeans.
Absolutely. And I feel like they're terrified. They want to separate us, or they're trying to separate us in any way they can. They're horrified of the idea that a Palestinian and a Jew can sit together, work together, elect to transform and be transformed together, because all they can imagine is that, there's one person holding a rifle and one person being at the end of that rifle. That's how they imagine their relationship.
Yeah. Okay. Just continue your thought and then we'll wrap it up.
No, just the idea today that the weaponization of anti-Semitism is basically securing that kind of encounter. Okay. That encounter that separates us.
Well, thank you very much. Enriching dialogue and discussion, actually. And so we shall revisit this one as the uprising continues and see where we are in that situation. So thank you, Cindy. Thank you, Ali. Aloha, Erica. And thank you very much, viewers. And mahalo nui loa. See you next month. Aloha.
Thank you, Ibrahim. Thanks, Ali.
Thank you.